Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Dawn of Yangchen chapter analysis video. This one's going to be for chapter 10, Theater. So, yeah, this is the chapter where we get Yangchen's meeting with the Shang merchants. The core of this chapter basically consists of, yes, she has a bit of a conversation at the end of the chapter with them, highlighting the challenge that she's going to have trying to change anything with them. The opening section of the chapter is effectively a way through Yangchen, sort of allowing them to explain how amazing the Shang cities are and how they came to be. We effectively get our history lesson on why the Shang cities exist. Why don't we know about them from any other Avatar era? And why are they so significant? So we get that whole thing explained here because they explain the Platinum Affair, a very important recent historical event that gets fully covered here. This sets up the next sort of sequence of chapters that will sort of properly put the plot into motion. Because right now, one thing you will note is that it's been very good on the character side of things, but you don't actually really get much about what the plot is. The plot right now is literally just that Yangchen is here to have a meeting with the Shangs to just try and make things better because things aren't going so well. It's not a particularly strong plot so far because it's just an Avatar trying to do the obvious thing that they do of trying to make things better and the challenge of speaking to world leaders and will she be respected. So what actually kicks, a more eventful plot into motion, it's not necessarily this chapter, but what happens in the coming chapters obviously turns this into a much more eventful book. So this really highlights that we're still quite early on in the book here. Like I said, we're not even 60 pages in, even though we're 10 chapters in. So it kind of highlights that they really spent their time developing the characters. But let's get into this here. So we ended off the last chapter with the parade sort of on their way into the kind of meeting hall. Boma got hit by sort of a frustrated Bin person who's obviously struggling. Again, to Yangchen, highlighting the problems that she's going to have to sort of try and fix when she has her conversation here. So she does talk to Boma at the start as they try and, fix the slight wound that he has. And she kind of talks about how if I hadn't fired the guards earlier on for what they did to Kavik, this might not have happened. But, Boma just tries to put it aside and that, it's not too serious. They can go on with this. So that's fine. So they walk into the room at last. Sadao, who's obviously part of her sort of retinue, introduces her to the other Shang merchants. So we sort of get the dynamic straight away. A few of them stand up, but Boma is very frustrated by the fact that they all didn't stand up. And he really makes a big fuss about this and is just like, in the Four Nations, you rise in the presence of the Avatar. And so he sort of forces them all to stand and show some level of respect to the Avatar. This is about one of the only times in the book we actually get an explanation on okay, we know about Boma from the Rift comic, but who is he? What's the deal with Boma? Why is he here? It says here, her guardian occupied a strange, undefined role in her retinue, and Yangchen never cared to formalize it to others. He was Boma, just Boma, and his presence beside her was not to be questioned. He didn't look the part of a dignitary, not with his weathered face and plain way of speaking, and nobles sometimes rankled at his presence. He had no problem rankling back. So that's just highlighting that, he's a friend, an advisor, he, organizes things for her, and he plays sort of this role of he is not from nobility, so he doesn't really have much of an issue kind of stepping in and being like, hey, respect the Avatar as well. So a kind of, in a way, much needed person in Yangchen's group. So it's just nice to get at least a little bit on him. So immediately we get introduced to, I suppose, the main person here in Bin. We're introduced to this character called Henshi. H-E-N-S-H-E. Again, not sure what the pronunciation is on that. It's either Henshi rather directly or Hensh or something like that. Audiobook is going to be a savior for a lot of these pronunciations when it comes out. So this is where we get a few things here. He says, I am Henshi Zongdu of Bin Maybe that's meant to be pronounced Zongdu. I'm not sure, again, about how... Because it's this weird thing with pronunciation in Avatar, whereas if you go off the shows, they tend to have a slightly more Western version of pronunciations, but so far in the books and the audiobooks, they've gone for a more traditional style pronunciation. And of course, you have situations like, say, Ang. If you want it to be super traditional, should probably be pronounced Ang. Like, Kelsang is actually Kelsong. That's the actual pronunciation of the name. But no one's going to start calling Ang Ang. Because we saw what happened in the last Airbender movie with that. But either way, I'm just going to go with what flows nicest for now until we get the audiobook. So this is Henshi Zongdu of Bin we are blessed by your visit. He is described as being a deeply handsome man in his mid-20s, the youngest person ever to hold the position of Zongdu. Zongdu is basically the effective leader of a certain Shang city. We'll get it explained in a second, but that's the way you view this. So there are 4 Shang cities, so there are 4 Zongdus, one for each of them. And they are sort of like the key players in a way in the story. At least in this book, 2 of them are, but we'll get to that. But Henshi, for the sake of this book, he is effectively our antagonist as such. I hesitate to even call him a villain, because the actual like incident that happens in this book is obviously something the Avatar needs to get involved in, but it's maybe not as like big of an event that is such a thing where it's like he is villainous for what he is doing, in that the Shangs, as we see, are villains because they don't seem to show a particular amount of care for the people in their cities and a want to change, as we'll get to. And they just want to keep things the same because they have a high position, and change might lead to that being affected. And that's why the characters are the villains. And that's why, like, you'll see in a lot of reviews, I think, people highlighting that the villains in this book are not as good as the villains in either the previous 2 Kyoshi novels, and that we've had better villains in Avatar than these. Now, again, I'll bring up the idea that, you know, highly likely the general stuff we're dealing with here is also going to be most of the plot for the second Yangchen book, and there's always room for more to happen there. So, we basically just get this idea of like, this is Yangchen doing what she needs to do. Very kind of public. This is the official meeting she has to have. So there's a lot of kind of ceremony at play here, of like just a lot of polite words back and forth of just like, oh, you have a lovely city, it's nice to meet you, you know, blah blah blah, effectively nothing actually happening. There's a few kind of fun little moments where Henshi actually asks, oh, you don't have your famous lemurs with you? I would have loved to have kind of seen them, because I've been told they're adorable. And again, she just notes that like part of the reason she left Pick and Pack at the Northern Air Temple is just that they tend to obviously like fight a little bit, so just having them there in the middle of an important meeting fighting on her shoulder would have been too much of a distraction. So that's that. This is where he brings up the idea of like, oh, this is the Avatar's first time visiting one of the Shang cities. Let me explain to you the wonderful system and how it was formed. So he's trying to give her the full kind of history lesson here on it. Now, she basically reveals that she sort of knows the whole thing, but because she wants to be seen as being sort of polite with them, she doesn't like interrupt them, be like, hey, I know this already. She lets him speak so that she will then be allowed to speak and be listened to. And, you know, the sort of very much, this is how you have to play these situations with these kind of important people. So again, we get the idea here. This is where I suppose in the book you properly get the idea that she already knew how the current version of Binur came to be, and Taku and Jonduri closer to the Fire Nation, and Port Tugok near the Southern Water Tribe. So in her mind, you know, the system wasn't ancient, so there wasn't much to learn, but she just, you know, let protocol happen here and let him tell the story. Now, interestingly, he leads into this by basically giving his own personal backstory, and you get little bits and pieces in it, but ultimately they cut to Yangchen just kind of thinking like, okay, get to the show, and then we cut back into her, I suppose, actually properly listening. and I suppose like her explanation of the platinum affair to us. So kind of highlighting in a way that Henshi as like this main character who's just been introduced here, his backstory is not particularly important. He just says, when I was but a young boy living in the outskirts of the Middle Ring, I dreamed of a place where opportunity could be reaped by anyone with the will to sow. As I grew older, I often spent my days down at the supply gates, watching carts full of trade goods flow in and out, like lifeblood through a beating heart. And yeah, we just quickly cut away from that of just like, okay, he's from Ba Sing Se originally, but he somehow gets involved in the Shang sort of situation, and so on. So this is where we get the idea of like the harsh truth was that Bin and the Shang cities owed their privileged status to the worst blunder of international politics in generations, the Platinum Affair. So the explanation on this, because this is the full foundation, this event is why we have Shang cities. So effectively what they say here is that this happened 8 years ago from the present day. So relatively recent within the life of Yangchen. She is 17 here, so this happened when she was 9. So it actually happens a year after the first chapter, so in recent memory. That's why Yangchen is getting across the idea that she basically already knows this, but okay, what's your perspective on it as being part of this system? So we get the idea here that Earth King Feishan, Feishan, is going up against rebel legions of General Nong, Nong. So that seems to be a relatively standard thing that we've seen in history in Avatar. An Earth King and an opposition by a notable leader somewhere else in the Earth Kingdom. So Earth Kingdom having internal problems, and the other nations try to take advantage of this. The Fire Lord and chief of the Water Tribe lost patience and conspired in secret to back Nong. So they want to back the rebel, not the Earth King. So what they do is they loaned funds to the Earth King in the form of paper banknotes, and then sent Nong ingots of platinum, highlighting the difference in sort of quality there, that they're publicly making it seem like they're just neutral in this, and they're just sort of helping out both sides. They're not having any preference particularly. No one should have any reason to be suspicious of them. But obviously, platinum, very valuable metal, is a much more valuable form of currency than paper banknotes. And so that highlights that they are preferring the rebel in this conflict over the actual Earth King. So this is, their kind of sense of, I suppose they're effectively thinking, we take down the actual leader of the Earth Kingdom. We more heavily show that we are backing the ruler to be. We get a great deal with the new Earth leader. That's, I suppose, the Water Tribe and the Fire Lord's view on things here. But then the slight twist here is that the Earth King is not some idiot in this era. What no one accounted for was the Earth King's hidden boldness and surprising battlefield acumen. He found the moment he'd been waiting so long for, fell upon General Nong at Lamapaka's crossing, and wiped his enemy off the face of the map. And it's clear that, it says it here, he knew what happened here. He knew that they were trying to kind of big up the other side of this, sort of betray him. So he, who has won this conflict, he claims the platinum as well as having the paper banknotes, of course. And they say here that what he does is he kept the captured platinum, melting it down and using it to plate the giant badger mole statue behind his throne. Relations would return to normal when the entire surface fully tarnished and appeared as stone, he declared, which was to say, not for a century or more. So the idea is that he closes the Earth Kingdom ports, cuts off diplomatic communications, and expels ambassadors from the Earth Kingdom. He effectively isolates the Earth Kingdom from the other nations in response to what's happened here, and basically says that what you did with the platinum here, it's now plating my badger mole statue here. And he kind of says that we'll go back to normal when this platinum effectively dulls over time. But obviously the thing with platinum is it's such a pure metal, it's not really known for doing that, so a very, very long amount of time is going to pass before things go back to normal. And because the Earth King is the biggest nation, this runs the risk of making things particularly bad, especially when in response to this, the Water Tribes and the Fire Nation basically say they're going to do the same thing. So they isolate themselves from everyone as well, and suddenly now 3 of the 4 nations aren't trading with each other. Effectively, no one's really trading with each other because, of course, the air nomads are kind of doing their own thing. They're sort of immune in a way to what's happening there. They're still allowed to travel around, but the 3 main nations have no relationship with each other. And it suddenly, they all realize something has to change because, as it's pointed out here, Earth King Feishan and his court still liked Fire Nation pepper and Water Tribe lamp oil. There was still money to be made exporting fine Omashu silk. So, in a face-saving handshake between king, chief and lord, a few cities were chosen to handle controlled amounts of international trade under strict purview of selected noble and merchant families. These people became known as Shangs. So that is how the Shang cities came to be. The Earth King, surprisingly, completely turning around this situation where it looked like things were not in his favor, and him more or less controlling this situation here with regards to platinum misused in this situation. Trade between the main 3 nations shuts down. They reluctantly agreed to have some trade, but not directly with each other, which is why you have these sort of autonomous cities, the Shang cities, which are sort of separate even to the Earth Kingdom, as we see. Because it was mentioned, like Havoc, of course, he only does work in the Shang city. He doesn't go outside the Shang city because all of a sudden then it's like the Earth King is more in charge. So this weird situation where, like, way before we get like Republic City and these kind of pseudo different nations coming together, we effectively kind of get a kind of prototype version of that here with these cities. And obviously the placement of them is meant to facilitate trade in different places of, like, okay, there's one up north, one down south, one more in the middle close to the Fire Nation, and then one more specific to the Earth Kingdom. Makes sense. Very cool. And then says each Shang city has an elected officer called a Zongdu who is responsible for solving problems and collecting customs revenue on behalf of the respective nations. And then interestingly here, a Zongdu serves for a few years at most before we step down and are replaced by another. So by definition, it's this idea of you never keep that role for more than, like, what, 5 to 10 years, give or take. I think they might talk about the length as we go on, but the idea is that no one stays in this role for a long time. So it's weird that, like, in a way, the plot of this book is about them trying to keep things the same, but they always know they're never going to keep that role for particularly long. And there's an interesting point made here. Sadao says, in a way, they are avatars. And Yangchen's like, what? Even Boma's like, well, what? Sorry, you're going to need to explain this. A Zongdu is like a modern day avatar. They serve others in their time, in an endlessly repeating cycle. They hold one of the few important positions in the world granted by means other than bloodline. They negotiate between international parties and need not be born of the country they work in. Zongdu Dushim was Henshi's forebear, as Avatar Zito was yours. And Yangchen is kind of like, okay, actually that is somewhat clever. It might still be a little bit of an insult against the Avatar, but okay, that's fine. And Sadao also says, Avatar Zito would have surely approved of our great system. And this is really about one of the few references we get to Zito, as we see, you know, she just says, an unusual avatar, Zito had also managed to hold the position of Grand Advisor to the Fire Lord during his era. Many people weren't shy about telling Yangchen, the young air nomad, what her venerable predecessor would have thought, would have done. She waited for the others to cut in after Sadao. So we kind of move on here. So she's just like, okay, thank you for that history lesson. Can we get down to business? And she's kind of like, it's amazing, this system works very well, but then has to be like, but no system is perfect. And immediately the sort of tide begins to turn. They're kind of like talking to her, no real problem. And then all of a sudden they're like questioning her quite heavily here. No tower can stand on a mire of suffering. So she's basically pointing out the idea. There's a great deal of misery in the city that goes overlooked here. That, you know, you guys need to be more generous and make changes. And they're like, wait, you want us to give alms out? Like, like charity out effectively? Which for business people primarily, they view that as being like, no, we're not going to do that. But she says, no, I'm asking you to help me create a place where alms aren't necessary. That's important. She brings up the fact that there was a riot in the city last night. She knows that from Kavik now. And they're like, well, yes, there was, but it was quickly resolved. So she gets a little bit of an advantage because of that, but they do ultimately dismiss it. She does continue on and is like, it was you, Master Tane, who shortchanged your workers to the point of starting a riot, was it not? So here, like, you have to go back to like chapter 3, I think, to reference this. This is why it was happening in the first place. Okay, he shortchanged the workers. It seems you cancelled a construction project of your own volition before it was finished, and then decided you didn't have to pay for any of the work at all. So that's a pretty terrible thing to do. So that's why the riots happened and why they're basically sort of, you know, justified here. So that's a major problem. And he just says, last night I was waylaid by violent ruffians whom I didn't recognize. As for my dealings, they're entirely my own and no one else's. And she just points out, my point is, we can ease the troubles of Bin-Ur by treating its occupants with respect before they grow as desperate as they did last night. That means paying them fairly instead of abusing their lack of options due to the restrictions forced upon them by the Platinum Affair. And she points out as well that, you know, people are beginning to sneak out of this city unprepared, and basically the Northern Air Temple is having to take in these people who are struggling so much. And she kind of really points out that, like, look, you just told me the history and you're very proud of that history, but you have to realize that you have been placed into very privileged positions because of how the Platinum Affair went. Use that and slightly change the way things are run to help the people here, and then you will stop these riots happening, and you will actually make more money. And she's trying to, like, speak to them in their own language, but they don't want to change things at all, because it really comes across that they just don't care about the people. That the annoyance here, they don't want to put any effort in to try and stop it at the root. They just want to stop it by hiring thugs, basically. So, you know, they're kind of like, well, there's no formalities in place for doing what you're suggesting. And Yangchen's like, yes, but we can draft them. Every day is an opportunity in the Four Nations to make something happen. I will assist you with this along the way. An opportunity exists here. Let us go for it, basically. She points out, I have plans based off successful policies from the archives of Omashu that I'd be more than happy to share. The cost would not be onerous to any of you at the least. And then one of the other Shangs speaks up. And this is where they sort of, you know, this is the pleasantries are gone now. They're ready to kind of shoo Yangchen away here. So she steps up. Her name is Nohei. And she's like, is there a spirit in the room with us? And she just points out, many of us have heard your great prowess in spiritual matters, how you quelled the afflictions of the Sawang clan in the Fire Nation, the lives you saved in Tianhaishi from the Great Spirit. Though I have heard from some, it was actually a typhoon that leveled the city. So, few interesting points here. If you've read the previous two books and have read all the comics and stuff like that, you'll be familiar with both of these incidents. So, the incident with the Sawang clan is directly referenced in the Shadow of Kyoshi. This is the whole Phoenix Eels incident that Karuk ultimately had to deal with, and I think Yangchen references it as well. So here is it with the idea that Yangchen, at this point, has already dealt with that, it seems. The other thing, Tianhaishi, what's that? Tianhaishi is the name of the city from the Rift comic, the Yangchen flashback stuff there with General Old Iron and Lady Tianhai. So it makes sense in a way that Lady Tianhai was the spirit who sort of watched over that section of the coastline. So it makes sense that the place was named after her. So Tianhaishi. So that's pretty nice. And she references it here. Yangchen remained quiet, as she so often did when it came to her battle with Old Iron. But interestingly, people have come in the, basically months following this incident to say, like, though I think it might have actually been a typhoon that leveled the city, and not actually a spirit. And it's, in a way, it's highlighting she have very effectively dealt with this, as we'll come to see. So she says, I ask this because, well, unless we're being haunted right now by a glowing presence demanding silver from our purses, I don't see the merit of your demands. Bin-Er is a city of reason and commerce. We're not superstitious bumpkins who rely on oracles like the court of Tianhaishi, nor are we petty Fire Nation lords, cowering in our castles, praying for better harvests. And the dagger is fully put in at this point. The fact of the matter is, you don't have any right to tell us what to do. You don't have any power here, Avatar. You simply don't. And Yangchen basically has to acknowledge that effectively she doesn't. She, when she has these situations, does have to typically rely on people respecting the Avatar as this ancient position of a world leader. And the idea, especially that she is an air nomad Avatar, that they're going to give her some level of respect in that regard. But fundamentally, they're business people and they view this as being a major change that they don't want to have to implement. And they're kind of like, okay, we listened to you, we tried to be nice, but please leave now. We want to go back to doing things normally. Highlighting that they just don't care about the people. And that's what Yangchen is here for, because she actually does care. We saw her reaction to just the little bits and pieces she's seen of Bin-Er, and the whole idea of that alleyway that Ondo prayed through. You cleared out the clearly homeless people there because you didn't want me to see them. That should be something that's relatively simple to change with minimal effort, but they don't want to put it in. So interesting, and it's like, that they are our enemies for the book. Now, obviously, there's a little bit more to this, as we'll see in the coming chapters. There's a whole extra layer of more importance about why they're more directly something that needs to be monitored, rather than just, leaders not leading particularly well. So, an interesting chapter, though. Important world building in terms of introducing the Shangs, introducing at least one of our main Shang characters in Henshi, understanding the Platinum Affair, why these cities exist in the first place, the idea that they are sort of separate than the nations, but ultimately reliant on the nations as well, in that they facilitate international trade, but they ultimately have to, when they take in those customs fees, have to give that money to the Earth King, Water Tribe Chief, Fire Lord. So there's a slight sense that they don't really have all that much power. And I think it's also mentioned here that the Shangs themselves don't have like a military force as such. They're not allowed to have their own sort of guards necessarily. But as we saw, like, they can hire thugs and stuff like that to control things. Just give me a second here and I'll find the exact passage here, just so I'm getting this across correctly. Town councils were a thing of the past, and the Shangs weren't allowed to maintain a fighting force under the very terms that gave them their positions. So that's a thing that obviously means why, like, they're allowed to sort of exist independently without the other nations worrying about them, because they only have sort of specific control over trade that ultimately they get the money, the world leaders get the money from, so they don't really care, because they specifically forbid them from having actual like a military force. It's actually a sort of similar thing to Star Wars with the prequels, and the whole idea of, like, in a way, like, the Trade Federation isn't a planet or a nation to themselves. They're just like a corporation who facilitates trade. And a big part of the politics in the prequels was ultimately about, should the Trade Federation be allowed to have their own military force to protect their cargo on the way, and what that does and does not allow them to do. And that's part of the politics aspect of the prequels, which is actually very interesting, but people obviously dismiss as being boring, even though it's not particularly boring. But just a slight similarity there here, in that ultimately that's what we're dealing with here. It's kind of a very political type situation here, and it's obviously going to interest some people, not interest other people. If you just want the big bending battles, yes, it is slightly unfortunate that there is not a particularly abundance of bending fights in this book, but I still think it's very, very good Avatar. So, they're my thoughts on Chapter 10, Theatre. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this important world-building chapter. What were your thoughts on the concept of the Platinum affair from the past, the formation of the Shang cities, and most importantly, I suppose, how Yangchen's meeting with the Shangs goes here. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.